Greetings. My name is Kiera Eckhardt, and I am a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the University of Kansas. My presentation today discusses Ecuador's approach to migration, focusing specifically on its 2008 constitution and the idea of universal citizenship that is present. My goal is to explore whether this policy, often praised as progressive, actually protects migrants in practice, or whether it creates conditions that could be considered a form of legal harm. To begin, it's important to understand Ecuador's historical and political context. Ecuador is a country located on the Pacific northwest coast of South America, bordered by Colombia and Peru. It has a population of roughly 18.1 million people and was once a part of the Spanish Empire before gaining independence in 1822. Since then, Ecuador has experienced frequent political change, including military rule during the 1970s and a return to democracy in 1979. Over time, Ecuador has adopted 20 different constitutions, reflecting its evolving political identity. The most recent, enacted in 2008 under President Rafael Correa, stands out for its progressive language. Notably, it introduced the concept of rights of nature, and more relevant to today's discussion, a policy of universal citizenship. This policy promotes the idea that all people, regardless of nationality, should have the right to move freely and be treated equally under the law. This constitutional shift did not occur in isolation. It coincided with growing migration flows in the region, especially due to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Since the late 1990s, millions of Venezuelans have fled their country in search of better living conditions. Ecuador has become one of the primary destinations, hosting hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees. In fact, Ecuador ranks among the top countries in South America for receiving displaced Venezuelans. Ecuadorian leaders have framed their response to this crisis as both humanitarian and forward-thinking. The idea of universal citizenship is rooted in the belief that migration can enrich societies and reduce discrimination. It challenges traditional notions of borders and argues that the right to mobility should extend beyond goods and capital to include people. At first glance, this sounds like a powerful and inclusive vision, but this raises an important question. Does this progressive language actually translate into meaningful protection for migrants, or is it more symbolic than practical? To answer this, we need to look at how scholars have interpreted Ecuador's universal citizenship policy. Many describe the policy as progressive in theory because it promotes inclusivity and equality. Some research even suggests that such policies can positively influence how migrants perceive themselves and their place in society, potentially aiding integration. However, others have been more critical. A key concern is what has been called the invisibility bargain. This idea suggests that while migrants may be granted rights on paper, their ability to access those rights depends heavily on how they are perceived by society and the government. In other words, rights exist, but their enforcement is inconsistent and unpredictable. Additionally, critics argue that the policy is largely rhetorical. While Ecuador's constitution speaks of universal citizenship, it does not clearly define how this principle should be implemented. For example, there are limited guidelines for obtaining legal status, accessing services, or ensuring equal treatment under the law. This lack of clarity raises concerns about whether the policy has real substance. Another important concept in this discussion is legal violence. Legal violence refers to harm or suffering that is produced through laws and legal systems. It occurs when laws restrict people's lives in ways that are normalized and accepted simply because they are legally sanctioned. In this case, the question is whether Ecuador's constitutional language creates conditions that indirectly harm migrants, even if it appears inclusive on the surface. To explore this, I conducted a discursive analysis of Ecuador's 2008 constitution. This means I closely examined how migrants are described in the text of the Constitution and whether that language supports or limits their rights. The Constitution does include several provisions that appear supportive. For example, it recognizes the right to migrate and explicitly states that no person should be considered illegal based on their immigration status. It also affirms the rights of asylum seekers and guarantees access to basic needs such as food, shelter, and health care for displaced individuals. However, when we look more closely, significant gaps emerge. While these rights are clearly stated, the Constitution does not explain how migrants can access them. There are no detailed procedures for applying for asylum or sanctuary, nor are there clear guidelines for how the government ensures these rights are upheld. This creates a situation where rights exist in theory but lack practical mechanisms for enforcement. For instance, if a migrant is displaced but not formally recognized as an asylum seeker, it is unclear whether they are still entitled to the same protections. Similarly, while the Constitution promotes universal citizenship, it only advocates for it while outlining without outlining concrete steps for implementation. These ambiguities are important because they shape how migrants experience the law in their daily lives. Without clear procedures, access to rights can become inconsistent and dependent on external factors such as bureaucratic discretion or social attitudes. Despite these limitations, it is important to distinguish between ineffective policy and harmful policy. While Ecuador's constitutional language may be vague and difficult to apply, it does not necessarily create conditions of legal violence. The key reason is that the Constitution does not actively restrict migrants' rights or impose suffering through its provisions. In fact, the presence of inclusive language, such as the rejection of illegal status and the recognition of basic human rights, can provide a foundation for legal protection. Even if these rights are not always fully realized, they offer a basis for advocacy and accountability. Therefore, the conclusion of this analysis is somewhat nuanced. Ecuador's universal citizenship policy is largely rhetorical and lacks clear mechanisms for implementation. However, it does not constitute legal violence because it does not inherently produce or legitimize harm. Instead, it represents an aspirational framework, one that signals inclusion but falls short in execution. Looking ahead, there is a clear need for further research on this topic. One major gap in the existing literature is the lack of direct input from migrants themselves. Understanding their lived experiences would provide valuable insight into how these policies function in practice, and future studies could involve interviews with refugees, service providers, and policymakers to better assess the real-world impact of Ecuador's migration framework. In fact, I was able to interview 12 refugee service providers on background based on this analysis and have a forthcoming chapter in the edited volume tentatively entitled Power and Peril, Governance and Violence in Latin American Migration that I highly recommend everyone checking out when it becomes available. But in conclusion, Ecuador's 2008 Constitution presents a compelling vision of universal citizenship and human mobility. It reflects an effort to respond to global migration challenges with empathy and openness. However, without clear pathways for implementation, this vision remains largely symbolic. While it does not rise to the level of legal violence, it highlights the ongoing challenge of translating progressive ideas into meaningful and effective policy. Thank you. For comments or feedback, please contact me at kiera.eckhardt@ku.edu. And this research has been generously supported by the Madison and Lila Self-Graduate Fellowship, the Tinker Field Research Grant through the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Carol D. Clark Field Research Grant, all stemming from the University of Kansas. I sincerely appreciate your time.